Good evening. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dan Schnur Political Report. Tonight, Dan's focus will be what's that up in the sky? Balloons, UFOs, and an investigation of foreign surveillance. Hey, Dan. We're so looking forward to this focus on China tonight. You're on mute. There you go.
After all these years, you think I'd know how to do this, huh?
You're just fooling us. Anyway, we're so looking forward to this. I don't want the audience to waste a minute with you. For all of you who want to ask Dan questions, I think you know the drill. Type your questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those in about half an hour. Thank you, Dan, so very much for everything that you do.
Thank you, Kim. And thanks to everyone for being with us tonight for this month's webinar. And I have to admit to you that I never thought I would begin one of these programs by talking about Chinese balloons flying over the state of Montana. But such is the current state of US-China relations in this very difficult period. And so this is where we are. Now, I would say, just as an aside before we get to work, I would say, looking back at that whole conflagration in February over the Chinese surveillance, I will say that I think that the term balloon has had the unintentional effect of trivializing the importance of the rising tensions between our two countries. I mean, look, a balloon is a children's toy. It's a circus amusement device. And had we seen stories last month about, say, an airborne Chinese surveillance device instead of a balloon, I wonder if the public reaction might have been somewhat different. But regardless of the language we use, US-China relations, which have become very strained in recent years over any number of issues, over Taiwan, over technology, over human rights, over the broader global rivalry for influence, those relations have gotten even worse just in the last few weeks, not just because of this spying and surveillance argument, but also China appears to be ratcheting up its support for Russia's war in Ukraine. And now we're seeing fresh intelligence assessments out of the US government that COVID-19 may have leaked from a Chinese laboratory rather than from the marketplace, as many had previously believed. So before we get any further into the details here, I recognize that there is a lot going on. So we're going to start with our very first question. Christopher, if you can put up the first question for the group. There we go. A pretty straightforward one. Are you more or less concerned? Are you more or less concerned about US-China relations than you were a year ago? And we'd ask you to choose between the following. Are you much more concerned than you were a year ago about the relationship and the tensions? Are you just slightly more concerned? Has there been no change? Are you the same as you were 1 year ago? Or alternatively, are you slightly less concerned? Or finally, are you much less concerned? Let's see what the group has to say. And Christopher, if you can put up well, there's the results already. Look at that. This is not a relaxed group at all. 51%, more than half of our group, are much more concerned about the relations between the two countries. An additional 42% are slightly more concerned. Means 93% of our group are more concerned than they were 12 months ago. And the rest say no change. There's not a single respondent in our group that is less concerned about the tensions between this relationship than we saw a year ago. Very interesting. So we're not the only ones who are increasingly concerned. We're seeing that concern throughout the political landscape also, and most notably in Congress. Now, there's an old saying in politics, and some of you have probably heard it, but the saying goes, be suspicious of anything that passes by unanimous vote. Be suspicious of anything that passes Congress by a unanimous vote. And that quote is most frequently attributed to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But regardless, it is worth noting, and I think it's somewhat accurate, because under normal circumstances, the only legislation that passes through Congress without any opposition at all are fairly symbolic and perfunctory bills. Bills to rename post offices, to honor Olympic medalists. So when the House voted last month, 419-0 to condemn China for the surveillance device that was shot down off the coast of South Carolina, it was notable that members of both parties stood together, even in such a highly polarized political environment that we're seeing on so many other issues. And they stood together unanimously to rebuke the Chinese government for its violation of US airspace. Now, what makes it even more notable is there was a discussion before that vote going on in the Republican caucus. And a lot of the Republican members, who, as I know you remember, a few weeks before that, had barely been able to come together in 20 ballots to elect a House Speaker of their own party. The Republican members set aside an alternative bill that had been drafted that, instead of condemning China, would have criticized President Joe Biden for the way he's handled the incident. And of course, that measure would have passed, and it would have passed on a straight party line vote with all Republicans for it and all Democrats against it. So this broader resolution was somewhat interesting, watching the Republicans passing opportunity to score some easy partisan points. And on the flip side, a group of Democrats who often vote against anti-China measures to guard against prejudice faced by Asian Americans also stood down. So 419-0, we don't see that often, at least on matters of such import. Now, this followed on a similar vote back in January, just when the new Congress was just getting underway, when the House voted to create a new select committee to investigate China's human rights and economic and military policies. And this one didn't pass unanimously, but the measure did pass. The bill did pass by an overwhelming margin. Every Republican member voted for it. And more than 2/3 of House Democrats, only a few days after Kevin McCarthy had been elected Speaker, when tensions were at a very high level. Now, last year, if you look back a little bit further, last fall, Biden was able to pass a bipartisan bill that authorized billions of dollars in semiconductor subsidies for US-based manufacturing of semiconductors. And the way it passed with bipartisan support is that the White House framed it as protection against Chinese technological dominance. So all of a sudden now we have this surveillance device, which ratchets up public concern to an even greater degree. And I would say, I say this cautiously, but I've come to this conclusion, that despite the very complicated and important economic ties that bind our two superpowers together, we appear to be creeping closer to a new Cold War. And for the foreseeable future, as a result, what we're going to see is Democrats and Republicans competing with each other to see who can sound tougher on China. Biden's public statement after ordering that the Chinese balloon be shot down was extremely enthusiastic. And the Republican criticism of the president was just as belligerent. Lots of chest beating on both sides on this one. And even the Democrats, even the president's Democratic allies have been criticizing Biden publicly, letting it be known that they have expected more from him on this issue. So there's a lot of animosity, there's a lot of belligerence, and we're going to talk for a little while further today about how to navigate that very, very tense political environment. Now, it is worth noting, of course, that aside from wanting to avoid war, cold or hot, at any opportunity, there are very important geopolitical reasons to avoid further escalating these tensions. Most notably, and we talked about this a little bit last month for those of you who tuned in and who remember, one important reason for this situation not to get any worse is that Xi Jinping, it seems to be playing an instrumental role along with the leaders of India in convincing Vladimir Putin to avoid the use of biological or tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So all of which is to say, we need to be careful about this getting out of hand. But right now, at least from a domestic political standpoint, make no mistake about it, there is no political downside whatsoever for any American politician of either party to expressing very loud and very harsh belligerence toward China. Now, there's a lot of aspects to this issue, and I've mentioned a few of them. But before we dig in even deeper, Christopher, if you can help me out here, let's try to break down the various sub-challenges that exist within the China-US relationship. So our second question here is, which aspect of US-China relations is most important in your mind? Is it economic issues, trade and economic piracy and other related matters? Is it the question of Taiwan independence? Or number three, not just Taiwan, but is the greatest concern broader security and military issues, not just Taiwan itself, but broader geopolitical tensions? Fourth, is it human rights policy? Or fifth, given the recent information that's been released from the US Energy Department, is it COVID-related issues? Which of these five matters do you think is the most important one? They're all important, obviously, but Christopher, when you have the data, let's see what our group ranks as the most important aspect. Also very interesting, 57%, more than half of you, talk about broader security and military issues. And that's in addition to the 13% that talk about possible tensions over Taiwan. Add those two up and we're looking at 70%, more than 2/3, almost 3/4, who say that military and security issues of some type, Taiwan in particular or more broadly, are the most important aspect of the relationship. 27% say economic and trade issues. And very interesting, only 2% say that human rights policy is the most important concern. And only 1% say that it's COVID-related issues, which I guess tells us more than anything how far many of us feel the pandemic to be a matter in the past. Well, anyway, I want to get back to the way Congress is dealing with this, because just last week, that House Select Committee on China that I talked about earlier that was created by such a large majority, well, they kicked off their first hearing last week. And what was really interesting to me, especially interesting to me, is although the House, the Republican-led House, of course, has been talking about all the different types of oversight hearings they want to be doing on Afghanistan, on Hunter Biden, on COVID, on any number of other issues. This committee meeting hearing on China was the first hearing that they held in prime time, not during work hours, but in the evening, which indicates that they wanted to highlight this and for it to get much more public attention than their other hearings have. And so a primetime hearing focused on the overall threat, quote unquote, caused by China tells me that this is an issue that both parties see as being of critical importance. And what I will say, I'm somewhat encouraged on this because the chairman of the committee, the Republican from Wisconsin, Mike Gallagher, and the Democratic ranking member, Raja Krishnamurthy of Illinois, the two of them have worked together in a pretty cohesive way in the past on any number of issues. And both were picked very specifically by their leaders, by McCarthy, the Republican leader, of course, and Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader. They were picked to chair this committee as two members who are held in fairly high bipartisan regard. So unlike a lot of the oversight committees where you see a lot of publicity hounds and ideological outliers in both parties, this seems to be a much more grounded group. And as I said before, Gallagher and Krishnamurthy, have teamed up quite a bit in the past. They've developed a very solid working relationship. And they seemed, both in the run-up to last week's hearing and during the hearing itself, they both seemed to be very determined to keep the committee's work from descending into the type of knee-jerk partisanship that's turned Congress into such a circus in so many other areas in recent years. Now, the danger is even on a bipartisan basis. I talked earlier about how both sides are ratcheting up their language toward China. And the danger is that type of very forceful language can turn into jingoism. And then hopefully not, but potentially into open conflict. But there was a particular statement that Chairman Gallagher delivered in the hearing, and I want to share it with you because I did find it to be somewhat encouraging. He said, and I quote, Chairman Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin, he said, quote, "A Cold War paradigm reminds us that we should endeavor to make sure it stays cold and doesn't turn hot, and that our core function is deterrence and preventing hot war." And so I do feel, unquote, so I do feel better knowing that both the Republican chair and Democratic ranking member do recognize how tense this relationship has become, but that they do seem determined, equally so, to keep these very, very difficult relationships from turning into something more dangerous. Now, we'll see if such a measured approach can hold up in the face of what's going to be almost certainly unyielding political pressure from both sides. But it's a good place to start, I think. But what do you think? Am I being too optimistic? I've never really thought of myself as an ingenue, but you can all hold me to account. Am I being too optimistic about the ability of Republicans and Democrats to work together on this issue? What do you think? Christopher, can we come up with put up question number 3? Okay, question number 3. Can Democrats and Republicans forge a bipartisan consensus on China? Pretty straightforward here. Option number 1, definitely. Option number 2, likely, or probably. Number 3, possibly, maybe, maybe not. Number 4, doubtfully. Number 5, definitely not. So my own feeling, and I usually don't put my thumb on the scale on these while you guys are still voting, but I would say that it's likely that the two sides can forge a bipartisan consensus. I'm not brave enough to say definitely, but as I said a moment ago, I am somewhat optimistic. So Christopher, is the rest of the group agree with me, or are they knocking me down to size? They are knocking me down to size. Look at this. 33%, only 1/3 of you agree with me that it's likely that the two parties will be able to work together. 47% say possibly. I guess that's not too different than I am, so I don't feel too bad. 11% are doubtful. 7% are very optimistic. They say definitely. And only 1% say that there's no way that the two parties are going to work together. So we might not be in lockstep, all of you and me, but I guess we're not that far off. But what I'm going to do, because I get to do this because I'm the moderator of these webinars, is I'm going to talk a little bit more about why I'm so optimistic. Now, make no mistake, the legacy of the 118th Congress, the legacy of this Congress, is going to be defined by its very high-profile divisions in partisanship on any number of issues. Republicans, as we've talked about earlier, are talking about holding sweeping investigations on a number of matters, some which I think are legitimate, for example, Afghanistan. Others look more partisan in nature, like the look into Hunter Biden's behavior. But by prioritizing investigations on the Republican side, and Biden, the actions of this week notwithstanding, Biden looking pretty ready to use his veto pen when the Republicans do pass something that he doesn't like. It's possible that China could be the only issue that could get through that partisan bubble on a consistent basis. And to me, it's a testament to how far the bipartisan consensus on China has shifted over the last 6 years. Yes, since Donald Trump's election, as the relationship between the world's two largest economies keeps spiraling into a worse and worse place, and hopefully not into direct confrontation. Now, the last Congress frequently condemned China's human rights abuses, but the next 2 years, I believe, are going to turn to a much broader focus on the security and military and economic issues that all of you have raised, but also as it relates to China's relationship with Russia, and of course, Russia's war on Ukraine. Now, Republicans frequently are already accusing the Biden administration of being soft on China. But what I'm going to do, just to give you some reasons for my optimism, is point to several examples in the last weeks where the two parties have actually worked together on the issues relating to China. Now, just a few days ago, the White House gave federal agencies 30 days to wipe Chinese-owned TikTok off of all government devices. And just today, for those of you who didn't see it, there was a bipartisan team of US senators, Republican and Democrat, who introduced legislation making it easier for government to ban social media companies such as TikTok that are believed to threaten US national security. And by the time that news conference was over today, by the time Republicans and Democrats had stood together on the social media and China question, the White House had already announced that Biden would sign this bill when it comes to his desk. Now, that's just one thing. Last week, the House Financial Services Committee moved forward with a series of bills that aimed at reining in China's economic influence on the world stage, and those passed on a bipartisan basis. The Biden administration has launched a massive semiconductor initiative based on the legislation that passed last year. And Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, made it very clear that the public rationale for that semiconductor manufacturing initiative is what she called the very heated global competition with China. So you've got social media, you've got financial and economic questions, you got manufacturing questions, and we haven't even gotten to Taiwan yet, or to China and Russia and Ukraine. So let's shift in that direction. Now, if American intelligence is right, and China is considering arming Russia in that country's war against Ukraine, we could be entering an entirely new era of international relations. And I know all of you have read, while China has been fairly equivocal, somewhat low-key in its support for Russia in the war, over the last week or two, there has been increasing reporting that China is preparing to shift dual-use technology that can be used for both civilian and military purposes, shifting that to Russia for use in the war against Ukraine. But on a broader level, Chinese military support for Russia would turn the Ukrainian conflict, which blessedly has remained a regional conflict, the death and destruction have been extraordinary, but it has remained on a relatively limited geographic basis. If China were to engage militarily on Russia's behalf, that conflict that's been limited to a very small patch of Eastern Europe, the Ukrainian conflict would explode into what I would consider to be a proxy war between two hostile blocs. The US and the European Union and the geopolitical West on one side would be supplying Ukraine, and then China, Iran, North Korea, and a few other rogues, we'll call them the East, would be helping Russia. And then you've got a third bloc, the West helping Ukraine, the East helping Russia, even though those terms are somewhat overly simplistic. You've got a third bloc, the global South, we'll call it, from India to Brazil to much of Latin America and Africa, trying to balance between these two camps. We used to refer to these countries as the non-aligned movement, or simply as the third world. And of course, that term connotes poor countries or developing countries. But just like in the Cold War, the tensions between West, the US and its allies, and East, the then Soviet Union, and its supporters, the global South became a landscape, became a battleground between those two superpower blocks. You have a democratic and a capitalist Western alliance facing off against an autocratic Eastern alliance. And then with the third, the global South, up for grabs, knowing that both Russia and China have considered advantages in that part of the world because of its investments and relationships in those areas in recent years. Now, another Cold War would be a lot different than the one we faced in the 20th century, mainly because even though the Soviet Union, of course, was a military superpower, its economy was never anywhere near the strength of the United States. China presents a much different and a much more difficult type of challenge. In addition, the US and NATO are still the main protagonists on one side, but Moscow and Beijing have pretty much reversed their roles. Back in the 1970s and 80s, China was sort of the junior partner in that relationship, and the Soviet Union ran the show. And it was almost completely a military and a diplomatic set of tensions throughout the course of the Cold War. But the economic challenges here, which so many of you noted correctly as a central part of the challenge between the US and China, those make it much more difficult for us to disengage the way the United States did with the Soviet bloc in the second half of the 20th century. I would also argue that the Chinese leadership is frankly much more savvy and much more strategic and much more focused than most of the Soviet leaders were through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And once again, this makes a much, much greater challenge for the US and its allies going forward. Now, as China, just in the last several days, begins to heighten its rhetoric, its language directed specifically against the United States, that's of much greater concern, because that tells me that China is willing to sacrifice, at least to some degree, economically on a temporary basis in order to create what they consider to be a more even playing field in this global cold conflict, if you will. And China, in addition to its very harsh language against the United States, is now making extra efforts to tell the global South that there really aren't any parallels between Ukraine and Taiwan. The United States and its allies have been saying that just as Russia has invaded Ukraine, China presents a similar threat to Taiwan. China is making it clear that in their mind that there's no similarity between the two whatsoever. And once again, on the basis of prior relationships and prior investments, while that's not an argument that's working for China among the US's Western allies, it's been a very effective argument in the global South. So we'll talk more about Ukraine and Taiwan and the parallels or lack thereof in just a minute before we wrap up and bring Rachel on for questions. But another question for all of you: do you think that the Ukraine war makes a conflict over Taiwan more or less likely? And Christopher, if we can put that question up for people to see. Does the Ukraine war make a conflict over Taiwan more or less likely? And of course, the argument is in favor, is that China believes that the West is now distracted and bogged down in Eastern Europe and less prepared for a conflict over Taiwan. The counter argument is that China watches how the West has held together much more strongly in a much more unified fashion than expected, which makes them less likely to move against Taiwan. What do you think? 5 options here. And Christopher, when we have the answers, let's put them up. Wow, that looks like very much of a split decision. 35% say the conflict over Taiwan is slightly more likely, not greatly, not much more likely, but slightly more likely as a result of Ukraine, presuming it appears that you believe that Western focus on Ukraine has made Taiwan more vulnerable. Add up the much more likely, the 16% there, and you have 51%, just a tick over half, saying that a conflict over Taiwan is more likely. And then if you add up the rest, you have 49% saying either no change or less likely. So very much of a split decision on these. Now, I'd like to talk about Taiwan for just a couple of minutes, and then I will ask Rachel to join me so that we can get to my favorite part of the program, your questions on these topics and anything else you'd like to talk about. But what I want to discuss is a couple of weeks ago, Representative Gallagher, the chairman of that select committee on China we were talking about earlier, Mike Gallagher took a trip to Taiwan a few weeks ago, and he did not publicize that trip before going. And he didn't talk to reporters while he was there. He only really talked about it in public after he got back. And the fact that he traveled there was interesting, but so was the secrecy and the low profile of the trip. Because you remember when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan last August, Joe Biden confirmed the trip before it was announced, which angered China. And then the Pentagon declared their opposition to Pelosi's trip. Both steps made it harder for Pelosi to go. She went anyway. And once she left, remember, China fired ballistic missiles near Taiwan and sent warships and fighters near the island to conduct what it called training exercises. Now, Gallagher was very aware of the fear caused by Pelosi's visit. So he kept his travels quiet because he said he wanted to have more productive meetings if there weren't the distractions of a public debate. Now, as all of you probably saw, the current speaker, Kevin McCarthy, was scheduled to go to Taiwan this month to meet with the Taiwan president, Tsai Ing-wen. And at the last minute, just yesterday, McCarthy canceled his trip. And it's been reported on the very strong urging of U.S. intelligence services. So McCarthy's going to meet with President Tsai when she comes to California in the next few weeks on her way to Latin America. And that should tell you the fact that Gallagher's trip was so low profile and that McCarthy canceled his altogether. That should tell you how concerned U.S. intelligence is about provoking China over Taiwan. Now, in spite of all this, Gallagher says he wants to hold a meeting of his select committee. He wants to hold a hearing in Taiwan sometime this summer. And then the goal, as it's been reported, is that McCarthy and Hakeem Jeffries would go to Taiwan after their next presidential election early next year. So imagine that, not just the speaker going to Taiwan the way Pelosi did last year, but the Republican speaker and the Democratic House leader going together. Now that sends a pretty strong message. Now, one other thing that Gallagher said about his trip is he said the war in Ukraine has impressed on Taiwan's leaders the need to acquire and stockpile more weapons. And he has become a very active voice for dramatically increasing the amount of military support that the U.S. provides to Taiwan in order to discourage any Chinese action against Taiwan. And so that leads to my last question for all of you. And Christopher, if we can put it up. Hopefully this can be avoided, whether by arming Taiwan, whether through diplomacy or other means. But if China were to invade Taiwan, should the U.S. defend the island? Option one, yes, we should defend Taiwan unilaterally if necessary. Yes, we should defend Taiwan militarily, but only as part of a multinational coalition. Third, we should not defend Taiwan, at least not with U.S. troops, but we should increase military aid like we've obviously been doing to Ukraine. Or fourth, no, we shouldn't risk a broader war. And so even if China does move against Taiwan, we should not engage either directly or indirectly. And Christopher, what did we get from this? Whoa, look at that. 57% would support the U.S. engaging militarily against China as part of a multinational alliance. And as we've noted in the past, this is a group that tends to lean somewhat leftward. So add that 57% who would defend China as part of a multinational military coalition with the 20% who would deploy U.S. troops unilaterally if necessary. That means 77% of our group, more than 3/4 believe that the U.S. should militarily engage on China's behalf should China invade the island. And only 20% say we should limit it to indirect military aid. And only 4%, only a very small number of you, think this is something we should avoid altogether. Now, what I will note, and then in just a minute, we will open it up to questions. I should note what an extraordinarily difficult military challenge this would be for the United States and our allies. The Wall Street Journal did an excellent piece yesterday, which I'd recommend, by Michael Gordon, talking in great detail about the difficulties the U.S. would face in a military conflict with China. The U.S. military success in the Middle East and in Afghanistan came in part from pronounced air superiority, a much, much less well-equipped foe, and the ability to control the initiation of the war. In other words, U.S. troops decided in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere when and where and how the war should be fought. A conflict with China would not have any of those advantages. So not surprisingly, the Biden administration is attempting to move very aggressively on the diplomatic front. And we can talk more about that as we go through the questions. But just in the last couple of days, the White House has made some very interesting and I think savvy decisions to try to advance the cause diplomatically to avoid the kind of military conflict that we've been talking about for the last several minutes. So plenty else to cover here, but we're past the bottom of the hour. And Rachel, if you wouldn't mind joining me, let's spend the rest of the time addressing as many of our group's questions as we possibly can.
Yeah, hi, Dan. We have so many great questions as always. So the first one is, do we have any specifics on what our intelligence agencies have discovered from the recovered pieces of the balloon?
We really don't yet. The U.S. military and both the Defense and State Departments made it very clear that they felt that there was an immense amount of knowledge about how Chinese surveillance technology works that have been accessed from the wreckage of the balloon, but they either have not completed that work yet, or understandably, have chosen not to share it publicly. But in either case, we don't really have any sense yet of what was learned as a result of that salvage operation.
So on a related note, we had a couple of related questions that I put together here. So was Biden pressured into launching three $225,000 missiles to shoot down balloons that weren't from China? What was the rationale for that decision? And why haven't we heard more about the other three objects in the skies over the USA?
Okay, so two really interesting and two really important related but separate questions. On the first one, it's not clear whether the Biden administration was pressured into ultimately shooting down the surveillance device or whether it's something they would have done anyway. Not surprisingly, the administration says it's something that they intended to do from the very beginning when they first saw it, not just over Montana, but over Canada, heading toward the United States. And they knew over the course of those several days that it made more sense to wait to shoot it down until it was over water rather than over occupied U.S. land. The president's critics, not surprisingly, claim that they pressured him into doing it. We don't know the answer to that. As far as the other three aerial devices, which have largely been forgotten, so I'm glad the questioner brought them up. As most of you remember, in the days after the Chinese surveillance device was shot down, the U.S. Military essentially lowered its threshold for monitoring unidentified airborne devices. In other words, think of it as the spam filter on your computer. If you turn off or turn down the spam filter, you get more emails that you don't want, but you do that so you don't miss an important one. Well, the U.S. military decided after its encounter with the Chinese surveillance device to turn down its threshold of monitoring so it would be aware of more airborne devices in case there was anything else that required similar action. And it appears what happened now, looking back, is that on 3 occasions in the following days, the military identified a device that they weren't certain about its origin or its purpose, and essentially shot down each of those three devices to err on the side of safety and precaution. But it now appears that none of the three contained any type of surveillance or military threat, and all were very innocent civilian devices. So whether the military overreacted or whether they were acting in an abundance of caution, given what they learned about Chinese surveillance capabilities, I'll let you be the judge, but it does appear that none of those other three devices posed any threat to the US or its citizens.
Shifting gears a bit to our relationship with China, how would a US debt default impact the strategic balance between the US and China?
A US debt default would be economically catastrophic, not just for the United States, but the world. In the short run, I don't think China would benefit from it. The global fallout across the planet would be absolutely tremendous. But in the long run, a global default of the type of which has been speculated, if it were to take place, that might not help China in the immediate. Everyone would suffer. But in the long run, it would provide immeasurable aid to China in attempting to, in continuing its efforts to establish itself as the currency of choice in international markets, while China has made some progress in recent years about convincing some of its allies to rely on their financial system of exchange. A US default would accelerate that shift dramatically. And I think all but the US's most loyal allies would end up in a Chinese-based international economic system. So in the short term, everyone suffers. In the long term, I believe it would provide a very, very significant strategic advantage for China and Chinese economy.
Thanks, Dan. Exactly what, if anything, can Congress practically do versus China other than political posturing?
Well, China can do any number of things other than political posturing, although let's agree that that's an essential ingredient just about anything they're going to do going forward. So for example, whether you agree or disagree with the legislation, the bill that passed on a bipartisan basis last year and was signed into law by President Biden to dramatically expand US manufacturing capacity, not just for semiconductors, but for other national essential products, is something that Congress can do to help make the US less dependent on China for necessary goods, particularly those relevant to national security. The US Congress can adjust US trade policy, depending on your point of view, to either be more accommodating and open additional trading markets with China, or given public sentiment at the minute more likely that they would further restrict trade with China, increasing tariffs even further, shutting off trade routes to an even greater degree. The US could decide, as Committee Chairman Mike Gallagher is suggesting, could decide to send additional military weaponry to Taiwan so Taiwan would be better prepared to protect themselves. Or they could decide not to. Congress could decide to move more forcefully through economic or diplomatic measures to increase pressure on China to address some of its greatest human rights concerns. On issue after issue after issue, from the economy and trade, to technology, to social media, to human rights, to Taiwan, to Ukraine, there's all sorts of things that the United States government can do, both Congress and an administration, in an effort to influence China's behavior. So I don't quibble with the questioner's premise. There's going to be political posturing no matter what, but there are no shortage of levers that the US government has to influence Chinese behavior. And we'll see over the months ahead which of those levers they choose to use.
So we've had a number of questions come in about economics, and specifically about this next question, which is, China threatened a war with the US today due to our relationship. Should we stop buying Chinese products?
Well, to be fair, while China's leaders used extremely confrontational language toward the US in the last day or two beyond what they've used before, normally they hint, but today they were much more stark in their statements. I didn't see anything, at least, and I'll defer because the questioner may have seen something I did not. But the reading I did yesterday and today, while China's leaders did offer some very confrontational language, there was nothing even remotely resembling a declaration of war. So we should be fair about that. That said, the premise of the question is a valid one. As China behaves more aggressively throughout the Pacific Rim, in the South China Sea, in waters off of Vietnam and the Philippines and elsewhere, as China appears to be ratcheting up its support for Russia, as it acts toward the US in other types of aggressive ways, should we continue economically engaging with China? Well, it appears that the American public and the American Congress are not saying we should stop altogether, but rather we should restrict our economic engagement with China. The challenge is restricting that relationship, whether it's through tariffs or other types of lessened economic engagement, is that's bad for the economies of both countries. So, for example, the agricultural markets, which is California's economic foundation and a critical part of the economies of states throughout the Midwestern and Southern United States, China is one of the US's most lucrative markets for agricultural products. So if we stop buying Chinese goods, or if we put up prohibitive tariffs, even higher tariffs on China, US exports are harmed also. So both the Biden and the Trump administrations have walked a very fine line in this regard. They have made it more difficult for China and US interests to trade, but they haven't shut it off altogether because they recognize the impact on US exporters, whether it's agricultural or manufacturing or otherwise. You may remember that in the last year of the Trump administration, President Trump decided to send hundreds of millions of dollars in government subsidies to US farmers to make up for the loss of their market share that they were no longer achieving because of the restricted trade with China. So on one hand, China's lack of good faith behavior on all of the other fronts we talked about does demand a response. Both of the last two presidents have agreed that some of that response needs to be economic, but both have been very aware that an economic shutdown or even slowdown between the two countries does hurt both countries.
So sticking with the economics theme for a minute, this audience member said, it seems to me that the East Asian semiconductor industry is based almost entirely in Taiwan. Does this add to the tensions and the desire of China to take control of Taiwan?
I don't know that China needs much more incentive to take over Taiwan. They believe this is one country, and they respond very angrily, not only toward other governments, but even toward private sector companies and individuals when they choose to highlight Taiwan in any way whatsoever. That said, the questioner is onto something here. China does recognize that even though their primary motivation is one of national pride and national unity, they do recognize that if they were to somehow interfere with Taiwan's ability to provide semiconductors to the US and our allies, that would create a great hardship and an immense national security risk to the United States, and that would obviously be to China's strategic benefit. Though you've probably noticed that in addition to the increased military relationship between the US and Taiwan, there is an increasing effort for the US to get Taiwan to locate more of its semiconductor manufacturing here in this country. It's still Taiwanese-owned companies, but by basing them here, it eliminates supply chain issues. But what we've learned is while Taiwan is agreeing with the US because they want to stay on the United States' good terms for all sorts of reasons, it costs between 3 and 4 times the Taiwanese to site a semiconductor factory here in the US than it does to cite one in Taiwan. Now, that has to do with labor costs, it has to do with minimum wage issues, it has to do with environmental concerns, all legitimate issues in their own right. But the bottom line is that for Taiwan to build a semiconductor facility here, it costs far more for them to do it here than it does back in Taiwan. They're willing to do it because they need US security, as we've been talking about up until now. But it does create some challenges. It does create some difficulties. And even while we're going to continue to see efforts to base more and more semiconductor manufacturing here in the US, Taiwanese owned or domestically owned, it's not going to be an easy process because it becomes so much more of an expensive process. It's worth remembering that, years ago in Mexico, more recently in China, more recently than that in Vietnam and the Philippines and elsewhere, other countries simply have much lower manufacturing costs than in this country. And so when we work to bring manufacturing capability back to the US, that raises prices here because it does take more money to manufacture the same product here as it does in these other countries. It's a trade-off that many have judged as necessary, but once again, it doesn't come without a noticeable downside.
We've also had a number of questions come in about China, Russia, and Ukraine. So the first of those is, do you have an idea of how the Ukraine war is being presented to the Chinese public?
The Chinese public is being presented a very similar version of the war that the Russian public is hearing. That US and Western belligerents forced the Russians to defend themselves, and that it's only because of ultra aggression on the part of the West that this conflict exists at all. You've all seen in the last couple of weeks, China beginning to look for ways to insert itself as a potential peacemaker to end the war. But the original proposal that the Chinese government made was so one-sided in favor of Russia that not only did most of Europe and the US reject it, but much of the global South was somewhat equivocal to it also. It did look somewhat slanted. But China, while it hasn't provided Russia with military support, at least up until now, it has been supportive of Russia in other ways, buying its oil and other exports that the US and Western Europe are no longer buying, but also offering them certain rhetorical support. And while, as you said earlier, she does appear to have been instrumental in convincing Putin to avoid nuclear or biological, the use of nuclear or biological weaponry, China has been voicing a fairly consistent level of support for Russia in this effort, again, by delivering largely the same message that Russia is delivering to its own people.
Actually, a really great segue to our next question. If China were to aid Russia militarily, at that point, how long do you think it would be until it turns into a global conflict?
Well, that's precisely the message that not just the United States, but most of the Western alliance is delivering publicly toward China, warning them in no uncertain terms what a much bigger problem would exist and what a much larger conflict would exist if China were to provide direct military help. It's worth noting that when German Chancellor Scholz came to the US last Friday for a meeting with Biden, remember that Germany is China's second largest trading partner in the world, and by far its largest trading partner in Europe. And Scholz joined Biden, not side by side, but Scholz voiced the same warning to China that Biden had, even risking relationships with a very important trading partner, saying that if you begin supplying military support to Russia, it's going to cause a much bigger global conflict. It's going to have untold harm on your economy. And as many observers, both inside and China and out, understand, is that China's economy has really been struggling in a post-COVID era. Some of that was the absolute shutdown. Some of it is the demographic challenges the country faces. There's all sorts of reasons, but China's economy is not nearly in as strong a place as it was just a few years ago. And having trading partners, particularly European trading partners, leveling these kind of warnings, hopefully can send an even stronger message to the Chinese leadership than hearing it just from the United States. I have not heard any of the Western leaders, Biden or Schultz or others, warn specifically about global war as a result. But short of that, they're being very, very forceful, not just privately, but in their public warnings toward China, including releasing the intelligence that on which their suppositions about Chinese military support have been based. So the warnings are very intense, but I haven't heard anyone, at least not any responsible Western leader, talking about it in direct military, in terms of direct military conflict.
I have two more questions. The first is, if China invaded Taiwan while Ukraine was still active, what do you feel the US would do?
I don't know that the United States would have a choice. Well, of course, the United States would have a choice. But Biden has indicated on at least a few occasions, in violation, it should be said, of official US policy, that the United States would engage militarily to protect Taiwan. And I suspect this is why so many of our group, Rachel, felt that the likelihood of war in Taiwan was greater because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. I think China is very likely calculating that forcing the United States and its allies to fight a two-front war, both in Eastern Europe and in the Pacific Rim, would strain US and allied military capabilities to a very difficult degree. So I do believe that the US, either unilaterally or as part of a multinational coalition, would intervene directly on behalf of Taiwan, but it would stretch military capability for the US and its allies very, very thin. And China is certainly aware of that. What I should say, Rachel, just to add to that, is I want to go back to a point that I alluded to at the just before you came on to join me. I talked about the efforts that the United States is making diplomatically to avoid the kind of worst case situation that we've been talking about for the last few minutes. Those of you who saw it, just in the last day, the White House announced that it will be hosting its second state dinner for a foreign leader. They hosted the first last year for Emmanuel Macron of France, of course. But they'll be hosting later this year the South Korean president, Yoon Suk-yeol, to come to the United States for a state dinner. And that's a really big deal in another country, not just to come to the White House, but to get a state dinner and that kind of treatment. And the reason the United States is doing this is, one, because South Korea has now taken over a lot of the trading relationships in the Pacific Rim that we've had in the past with China. But also because South Korea and Japan, for many years, as most of you know, have had all sorts of tensions over historical differences and historical hostility. Well, the new South Korean government has worked very aggressively to resolve these tensions with Japan. And the US understands that in order to put up a united front against China in the Pacific Rim, that Japan, that South Korea, that India, that Australia, and others have to be in lockstep. And because the South Korean leadership has been so aggressive in terms of expanding trade with the US and resolving these issues with Japan to allow for a more united front, the Biden administration decided to bestow this very rare reward of a state dinner on the South Korean president. And if that can strengthen relationships with South Korea even further and send a message to other US allies of how they too will be rewarded by being cooperative, I think that's the kind of lower key action that this administration has taken in hopes of avoiding a direct military conflict with China.
So I know we're very close to the end of the hour, but I do have one more question if we can get to it. What can we expect from negotiations with China re their military strength when they are spending so much less than we do, $187 billion versus $790 billion?
Okay. I guess what I would say, just to put those figures in context, is Japan has been increasing its military spending at a far more rapid rate in recent years than the US has. And that while China has a minimal military presence outside of its immediate neighborhood, they have the luxury of being able to concentrate their military presence in the Pacific Rim, whereas the US military presence, as we were talking about earlier, is in Europe, given the tensions with the Ukraine, is in the Middle East, given challenges with Iran and Syria and elsewhere. And so while the US has a much larger military, it maintains a much wider presence around the world. And this Wall Street Journal article from yesterday by Michael Gordon, which I really would strongly recommend, talks about, in fact, the tremendous advantage that the Chinese military would have in a direct conflict with the US in the Pacific Rim, because, as the questioner correctly suggests, even though the US does have a larger military overall, it's simply not possible for the US to deploy anywhere near as large a military presence in that region as China does. So the numbers are correct, but it also, those numbers don't reflect the difference between a global military presence on one side and a regionally concentrated one on the other.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dan, as always, for answering these questions, and to our audience for sending them in. And I'll turn it back over to you and Kim now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rachel. As always, I really appreciate your great work. And please, when you have a chance, thank Christopher for me too. He was excellent.
Clarity that you provide on all these complex issues. We always leave better informed. So thank you so very much. For those of you who enjoy these conversations with Dan, we have an after the webinar program that we're going to be jumping onto in just a few minutes. And it's in a format where you can talk directly with Dan. So if that appeals to you, please join us for these after the webinar sessions. Dan, I'm just going to run through some of the upcoming programs quickly before we jump on the after the webinar. We have a terrific in-person program this week on March 9th. This is Putin's Ukrainian Misadventure, What Has Russia Lost? With William Pomerantz, who is the director of the Keenan Institute, and Robert Kaufman, who is a key professor of public policy at Pepperdine University. On March 10th, we have conversations on AI, the future of personalized medicine with the Caltech Science Exchange. On the 28th, how the war in Ukraine changed Europe. This is the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, with President Emeritus of the RAND Corps, Jim Thompson. We have an in-person on April 5th with an author who's going to be focusing on America's second, how America's elites are making China stronger. And then we just are booking, and Rachel will get this up soon, the ambassador from Saudi Arabia, Ambassador Rima, the very first woman ambassador from Saudi Arabia to the United States. Many of you went to our Saudi Arabia trip this last fall, and we hope to soon get information out on our fall trip to Morocco this fall. And lastly, please put on your calendars, June 14th, we have an in-person with the executive editor of the Los Angeles Times, Kevin Merida, on the future of journalism. Thank you all for your ongoing viewership, and we look forward to seeing you at some of our events. Thank you, Dan. It's time for us to jump on your next program.
Thank you, Kim.